Okay. Hey, gang. In this segment, I want to ask and attempt to answer a question that many people have asked over the years, and that is, what happens to the innocent person who has never heard the gospel? It's put in different ways, like, what about the innocent native in Africa who's never heard the gospel, or something like that. But this is more than just a theoretical type question. It's really a visceral gut level thing that has to deal with people's eternal destinies. And I remember way back 40 some years ago and really wrestling with wondering about that. And this might be an opportunity for accelerated growth for you because, as I've mentioned in some other segments, that if we come across an issue and perhaps the answer that I give, if it's kind of tough, it might be a time for you to reflect upon the truth that's being said, and it may be the occasion, as I said, for accelerated growth. Some of the truths of Scripture are hard. But what happens to the innocent person who's never heard of the gospel? Let me read some scripture first, and then we'll jump in. But reading from Romans 1, let me read a few verses, starting at verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, and birds, and animals, and creeping things. Therefore, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for the lie, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who was blessed forever. Amen. And then from Ephesians 2, and you were dead in your trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. As I said, this usually is stated. What about the innocent native in Africa? But there are billions of folks over the world who have never heard of Jesus, not just remote tribes in Africa. Did you know that it's estimated that somewhere between 1.5 to 3 billion dear humans, image bearers of God, have never heard the gospel, never even heard of Jesus? They don't have a clue as to who he is or that he ever even existed. There are some people in the United States, like those who live in the utter isolation in some parts of Appalachia, in my state of North Carolina, for example, who have never heard the gospel. The last segment, I addressed the issue of why God is so narrow. And we saw that in light of all that God has done for us, We're blessed that there's even one way of salvation. But closely connected to that issue is the burning issue of what happens to those who've never heard the gospel. And this may take you aback, particularly those of you who know me, but listen carefully. Let me say categorically that God will never send a human being to hell for rejecting a Jesus that they never heard of. That would be unjust of God. I'll say it again. God will never send a human being to hell for rejecting a Jesus that they had never heard of. Can you hear God saying, I'm sending you and condemning you to hell forever for not believing in a Jesus that you never heard of? No. But before you either sigh a big sigh of relief or say, Mark, you're getting weird on me, we need to ask this question. Why was Jesus sent in the first place? Now, let me digress for a second. It's important that you pay close attention to the flow and logic of my biblical reasoning, or you may lose perspective if you step aside for 30 seconds to get a drink of water. As I said, this is not just a theoretical issue for academic debate. It concerns the eternal destiny of billions. Do you believe in hell? I mean, a literal eternal hell. Then listen as if your life depended on it. All right, I have 5 points I'd like to make. First, why was Jesus sent? John 3:16 says, For God so loved the world that he sent his one and only Son. Okay. Why? Why the gospel? Okay, we know we're sinners, right? But Jesus was sent to us based on what I just read from Romans. Jesus was sent because we all, and underline the word all, we all know and have rejected God the Father. That's not good news. It's damning news. The Father sent the Son because everyone has rejected him, the Father. You know, we usually associate the gospel with Jesus, and that's correct and that's true. However, again, why did the Father send him? Well, verse 18 states that God's wrath is present tense, being poured out on all of mankind outside of Christ. Now, why is that? The text says that the sin that people commit is that they are suppressing the truth that God is revealing about himself. That is, God's holiness traumatizes them, and so like a giant spring, they push it down and pull it as hard as they can to get it out of their get it or him out of their consciousness. They don't want to deal with or think about this kind of God. And in verse 21, it says that every single man or woman on this planet knows God in some way. That may come across as astonishing to you, and you may have never heard it put that way before, but that's what the text actually says. Look at it. It's astonishing, actually. Whether it be the native in Africa or the aborigine in Australia, I think that's where they are, or tribes in Siberia, or a peasant in the jungles of Cambodia, or wherever, every single person on this planet has knowledge of God. Not just about God, but they know him. They know the Father. in some way. They know him, and they have rejected him. That, my friends, is why Jesus was sent, at least in part. Now, second, and this is a very important fundamental assumption, God has revealed himself to every single person on the planet. In fact, according to the text I just read, he has revealed himself so clearly and so sufficiently that it leaves us all without excuse. It's a non-saving knowledge of God the Father that is revealed through nature, but that knowledge of God, it gets through and is successfully communicates the essential traits of God the Father. And as I said, his holiness traumatizes the sinful, dead sinners, and they reject the Father. They hate him, just as we did before we were regenerated. And again, in verse 21, it says they knew God, and that is how effective the revelation from God is. Personal knowledge of God, a personal encounter with God. So Jesus is sent on an urgent rescue mission from the Father because all of mankind in every region of the world has suppressed this revelation of the Father. And because of our union with Adam, we are born spiritually dead. This is really important. We're not just spiritually sick or dying. We are spiritually dead. And I'm going to go into more detail in later segments in my systematic theology series. But I really believe that is a very crucial issue for our day, and to understand exactly what it means to say that uh, a person is spiritually dead, because that will have a domino effect on everything else we believe. Folks outside of Christ hate God, are dead in sin, just as we were. I have this an example, which is I've heard repeated countless times. Suppose or think back to like ancient Egyptian or even the Aztecs, right? both, as I understand it, worship the sun as a god. And Mark, didn't they do the best that they could with what they had? Didn't they try as hard as they could with the information they had? I feel the weight of that question. It's existential. It's just a really good question. But if we look at the text, especially verses 21 through 23 and 25, what is really being asked is this: does God like idolatry? I mean, that's what worshiping the sun is, right? Put it that way, we know the answer, that God hates idolatry. Because at the core of idolatry is a horrible exchange, which is in verse 23 and 25. We exchange the glory of God for worshiping part of his creation. So that objection unravels as we unpack its assumptions in light of God's word. God is utterly holy, and we forget that. Religious activity in itself is not pleasing to God, and he does not see religious activity in itself as an activity in search of him, but rather it's an attempt to flee from him and his holiness. My third point, the question, What happens to the innocent native in Africa or China or Cambodia? I would say this. Again, it may startle you. The innocent person anywhere, absolutely, they would go to heaven. No question about it. The problem is this, y'all. The category of innocent people is a null set. There is no such person. There is no innocent person anywhere at any time, except, of course, Christ. The question, what about the innocent native in Africa, rests on a false assumption that there are innocent people in the world, and there are none. Following Paul's devastating critique of sin, not only in chapter 1 of Romans, but he hammers home in 3 chapters, chapters 1 through 3, the most devastating, dark critique of mankind in the annals of human history. And of course, at the end it says, but God, in His grace, saves us. But before the glory of the gospel, we have to see the bad news. And Paul systematically shows that Jew and Gentile alike, here and abroad, are all under God's judgment. And he said, in these chapters, first 3 chapters, which I don't have the time, obviously, to read all 3 chapters, shows the sinfulness of both the Gentiles and the Jews. And in verse 9, he says, what then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jew and Greek, are under sin, as it is written. Now, please listen to these verses, because it is the most devastating critique of the notion of innocence. None is righteous. No, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good. Not even one. Their throats is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. You know, remember, the mouth expresses what's going on in the heart. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Paul is quoting from here, there, and everywhere in the Old Testament to buttress his argument of the universal guilt and non-innocence of all people. So there is no such thing as innocent seekers for God. People start seeking when God sovereignly sets them to seeking Him. But apart from that, there are no people who are really seeking for Him. There are people who are seeking His benefits and so on. But we need to let Scripture speak its harsh reality, because to the extent that we understand the darkness of the bad news is to that extent that we will really fully embrace the beauty of the graciousness of grace and the mercifulness of mercy. So let us again return to the question of salvation of folks apart from explicitly accepting Christ. Is it possible for people to be saved apart from explicitly accepting Christ in the gospel? Well, I would just simply ask, do we really believe Paul's indictment in Romans and Ephesians? Do we really believe that all people outside of Christ are dead in sin? Do we really believe that? What did God do? Think about Noah's day. What did he do to the folks then? I think maybe we have a overly lurid view of what was going on then. I know that there was accelerated depravity during that time. We're told that. But surely there were some relatively decent people back then. I mean, God's wrath is being poured out on mankind now. And this is on people that, if we were to look at them as our neighbors, we would say, these are decent folk. But the only reason God promised not to flood and kill everybody again, the reason why he hadn't done it is because he promised not to. But he killed them because of the universal rejection of God the Father, just as we've seen in Romans 1:18 and following. It wasn't just because of the issue in Genesis 6 and all that entailed. If we lack knowledge of the gospel, listen to this, please. If we think that people can be saved apart from accepting the gospel, first of all, it's contradicted by what we just read in Romans. But practically speaking, if a lack of the knowledge of the gospel will give a pass, so to speak, to a good person who is sincere and allow them into heaven, then what happens to the urgency of the gospel? Are you following me? If we see that if some people can be saved apart from an explicit presentation of the gospel, and if they're just good, and that will give them a pass away from hell and into heaven, if they're sincere, then, again, what happens to the urgency, the real urgency of the gospel that we read of in the New Testament? If that is true, if there's some way that people can get into heaven who have never heard the gospel apart from Jesus, what is the worst thing that we could do to people who are in this state of innocence? Because they are decent folks but have not heard the gospel. Do you know what the worst thing that we could do to these people? It would be to share the gospel with them. Because then we would be putting their eternal destiny at risk if they rejected it. So it would be best to suspend all missions work, if we were to be logical. So affirming the innocence of anyone outside of Christ eviscerates or rips the guts out of the Great Commission and then turns it into the Great Omission. Just basically stay away from people and let them in ignorance, because in this scenario, ignorance is bliss. But friends, according to Romans and Ephesians and elsewhere, ignorance is not bliss. It's damnable. My fourth point, in Paul's conclusion in Romans 1 through 3, is that we all stand condemned before a holy God. And nobody has an excuse. Let me read verse 19 and following. Now we know that whatever law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by the works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes the knowledge of sin. All will know their own guilt before an infinitely holy God, so much so that they'll put their hands over their mouths on the judgment day. Nobody on the day of judgment will be able to say, "But God, I never heard the gospel," or "I never heard of Jesus." The picture that we get here, and it's tough, I acknowledge it, but that's why I'm saying that it's at these moments that your spiritual growth can be accelerated. If you wrestle with the tough but important truths that underline this, and that is God's utter holiness. And something that I should have made more of in my last segment about why is God so narrow, is that we are truly blessed that there is one way of salvation, given who God is and how we have universally acted towards God. The church has lost its passion for mission, global mission, due to a decline or deficiency in our understanding of the lostness of the lost and how dead in sin people are outside of Christ. So those who have never heard the gospel will be condemned for rejecting God the Father. They won't be condemned for rejecting a Christ they've never heard of. But those who never heard the gospel will be condemned for rejecting God the Father. But those who have heard the gospel and have rejected it are in double jeopardy, because they have rejected both the Father and His Son. Now, it is only just, and Paul makes this point, that there are distinctions and gradations of punishment in hell based on a person's knowledge and what they have done with that knowledge. But friends, it's still hell. But this needs to be pointed out that there are distinctions, and some of it is based on how folks live. But it says in verse 4, I believe, in chapter 2, that unbelievers are storing up wrath unto the day of wrath by the way that they are thinking, believing, and living. But some people's punishment will be worse due to their increased knowledge, increased opportunities. Like at the time of Paul, Jews had more knowledge than the isolated pagans of his day. A life of devotion to Buddha will send one to hell, but the punishment, I think, will be less than a sensualistic atheist due to what I call bad good works. Even though their good works can't save them, it's better that they do them than that they not do them. The motivation behind a non-Christian's good works is not God's glory, but it's still better than if they had lived a life of total sensuality and violence. I have a friend who is a Shaolin monk. He has devoted his entire life to following this path. He's now a doctor of Oriental Medicine. He grew up Catholic in a European country. And I mean, if anybody epitomizes an individual passionately and sincerely throwing themselves into a non-Christian religion, it is him. We're talking about a Shaolin monk these are the warrior monks, and he lives, eats, and breathes it, but nevertheless, he's suffering from cancer, and he may indeed die of it. And he has become a good friend, and I want to shake my dear friend and say, have you never asked yourself, I wonder if Buddhism is true? Just because I believe it, I can't make it true. You see, friends, the only reason, this is what I would want to say to my friend, the only proper reason to believe something is if it's true. Apparently, my friend has never done that in earnest, or he wouldn't be where he is now. Because I truly believe if someone earnestly seeks the truth, they'll find it. Many intelligent non-Christians' judgment will be increased and will be worse because they never asked a simple question. Who is Jesus? And why am I not believing in him? Why am I rejecting him? I can just hear God the Father asking him, as I said in my last session, if God the Father is committed to anything, it's the singular honor and dignity of his Son. Fifth and last, please don't point the finger at God for the lostness of these people who've never heard. Whose fault is it that between 1.5 and 3 billion folks have not heard the gospel? Is that God's fault? God has ordered us to bring the urgent news to people who urgently need it. We sometimes hear of God revealing himself through dreams to Muslims, and this happens. However, the primary means by which the gospel was spread in early church was the tireless efforts of Paul and others. God has ordained us to be the revealers, the visions, so to speak. God has commissioned his church to be his ambassadors of reconciliation. Please do not think that God will somehow miraculously reveal himself to all people who have never heard the gospel. Why did I say that? I mean, he can, obviously, and he does with some people. I've read incredible stories of dreams of Jesus, visions of Jesus that Muslims have had. But that's the exception, particularly in light of, if you look at the book of Acts, there were visions, but what was the standard means of spreading the gospel? It was hard work, shoe leather, especially on the part of Paul. But if we believe that God will directly reveal himself to everyone, then why go to them ourselves? He makes it crystal clear that he's already revealed himself to every single person on this planet who is old enough. But every person has rejected him. He can and he will use extraordinary means, but we must see ourselves as the primary, indispensable agents in his plan in reaching the lost, especially the unreached peoples who are Paul's passion. And in this regard, I can't help but read this text from Romans 10, where Paul, in his inspired logic, which is so compelling, he says, How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him in whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what has heard from us? So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. We need to recover the urgency of the gospel and to ask God what our role can be in God's glory being spread globally. I'm not trying to heap guilt on anybody. There's so many different needs. Most of us simply cannot go to Yemen or anywhere else for that matter. God has put us where He wants us. And there are many other ministry fields, but I do think we should ask, how can I help with global missions in light of what we've been talking about? Let me ask this. Would you mourn or would you rejoice if your child or grandchild said that they felt called to the mission field in Asia or Africa? Let us read the stories of the greats like William Carey and other missionaries to our children and grandchildren, and read them as the saints and heroes that they are. Ask your local church to spend more money on missions. And may we all individually start with ourselves and plead with God to give us a heart for the lost. Amen.